All right, thank you, OWASP. Introduction. Thank you for attending. I love Atlanta, off of disease. I couldn't deal with traffic, so the fact you're coming here, no through traffic, it means lots of people coming. Those who join online, thank you. Also, I'm away. For the future viewers, if you have to think across my YouTube, thank you. So such a privilege to be here. So today, I'm going to get to my intro in a second. So we're here to talk about, AppSec or software security. AppSec, software sec, to me, interchangeable. You'll see later, hopefully after today, you'll see when I stitch together what happened in the software development industry in the last 20 years, you get to see that a little bit more broad sense of, how we consider a modern application of software. But a little bit about myself, right? And thanks. So, like Sean said, I've been this 20 plus years, right? People say you don't get into cyber by start with cyber. I actually started as a software developer early on in my career, right? Computer science degree, graduated. Spent first half of my career in DoD, U.S. Army. I didn't know what Thomas was in the Army, so active duty have a year, and then in the reserve. Okay, and so over there I did a lot of IT ops, right? I ran, kind of. Yeah, when there's virtualization, right, I was working as a system engineer, system manager, networking, and then cyber has always been the heart of me, right? Cyber as well. And then the second half of my career, when I left Army active duty, so I get into private sector because there's more interesting things, innovation in private. So I went to private side on the customer side. Did a lot of my consulting days, whether it's independent consulting and for consultancy, and then obviously got the darker side of solutions because you can't really solve problems in the space if you don't understand technology. So I can do that, right? So I ran my consulting solutions practice, and then first time at vendor because I got so excited with the technology innovation that I decided to be part of it. A little bit more about other things. So currently in my other job, since Tom talked about reserve, actually I command a signal battalion in the reserves. We actually support real world missions right now to provide IT networking services, including what's happening in Europe. So very proud to be doing that. Okay, so let's talk about discussion today. Disclaimer, right? ASPM is a growing discipline space, technology space, even though I work for a vendor right now. But like I said, this is very much practitioner focused, very much vendor neutral. So it's not here to debate what it is, what it's not, but think about how we can apply that to innovate and modernize how we think about AppSec. So that's the purpose. And, I was just, when I was preparing for this, right, I was, if you all have, done this, I've done this a couple of times, in the last 10 years, when I start stitching together the trends of where we come along, whether it's in the development space, whether it's in the cloud, what now looking at AI, we stitch them together and looking at technology, looking at practices, some interesting trends. So in order to kind of figure out where we need to go, it's good to figure out where we came from and see the trends and mistakes along the way so we can actually move forward. And, before I get to that, right, so really once I talk about, the trends, you'll see really the last 10 years, right, been 10 years since DevSecOps manifesto. So I want to kind of share with you what I've seen, have really done a lot of actual groundwork with a lot of different clients across different verticals. There's some similar trends of what's not happening, right? And then obviously using that lesson learned to see how we can move forward in 2025 beyond, and then using some of the capabilities supplied by ASPM to do things differently. So that's the whole purpose. And try to use example case studies, right, versus death by PowerPoint. So let's talk about today, right? What 2025 software security means to you. Last week has been a very busy week, especially Friday afternoon, right? If you know what I'm talking about, what happened last Friday afternoon? Anybody know?
Now you put us on the spot.
Okay. So just curious. So really, in modern days, right? Everybody's AI. A lot of organizations, right? They're building AI because AI has to be part of the product for competitive advantage. I can't tell you how many times the developers are saying they're using Copilot, right? Any kind of AI assisted code. There's all the AI stuff. And then you have a very complex supply chain that pushes ideation to production. And obviously with the velocity, expectation using AI goes very fast, right? So really, what happened last Friday, right? This famous TJ Actions, GitHub Action, supply chain, made it to CISA, right, at dash NVD. This happened, right? So affected 23,000 repositories. So that's something you don't get to see when you just keep simply scanning your source code. This is attack on the build workflows, right, and supply chain. So, if you think the solar and wind was bad, this is pretty bad, right? So, also want to point out the fact that if you look at, it's already made it to CISA's CAF, known exploitative vulnerabilities, as a preface to see what we need to consider when you think about prioritizing what matters the most in terms of fixing application security issues. So obviously, big impact, key takeaway is how attackers nowadays can weaponize open source tools, well-known, GitHub Actions, well-known build tool, right, to weaponize it using supply chain vulnerabilities, right? So that you can just bypass all the scanners. So something to think about. And then what's AI, everyone talk about AI risks, right? So recently, actually, I was at a conference. I was meeting this deputy CISO. They have a pretty mature AppSec program. So they have everything dashboarded out, reported. But I'm like, hey, what's the impact of AI in your organization, your AppSec posture? So he just pulled up the phone looking at, what the dashboard was looking at. And then he said, what's interesting, right? We do see a spike of issues, right? They have, I'm sure, the dashboard out, right? Very customized. But a lot of that, as we start building AI apps, we hire a lot of developers. Those are new developers, citizen developers, new developers, maybe the ones who hasn't gone through all the training. And that's where we live at. And at the same time, this has also just happened in the last week. So thanks to Pillar Security, right? They did research, they actually identified if you're using Copilot or anything similar as AI's code assistant, you can actually backdoor this by changing the rule config. So it's almost like AI supply chain. So when you combine exploitation of your AI assisted co-agent along with supply chain, that some nasty things can happen. So I let you read about it, right? If you don't know about this, is also real. Again, focus on the importance of what's happening today. Okay. Right now, for many of our enterprise are, I talk to a lot of practitioners, right? And yeah, I gotta do something AI, I gotta do some supply chain, but don't forget, yeah, great, you have a lot of more cloud apps now, right? What about your traditional stack, right? For large organizations, you still have those, they call it the skeletons, right? The on-prem data centers, legacy apps, things that have not made it to redesign, refactored to modern apps, right? You just got to deal with those. So that is the current state, right? So what happens is, all that together, right? We have an expanded attack surface today, right? 2025, what does AppSec means is that you've seen AI, supply chain, and then you have converged code. That means everything, right? Everything is turning to code, right? We see this a couple of years ago when you're looking at all the build workflows, your cloud infrastructure's code, everything, configurations code. Some more advanced organizations are experimenting with, obviously open source, open policy agent, right? The Rego policies for policies code, it's all code, right? That's kind of what's happening. Expanded attack surface, of course. Oh, bad animation. And then you have very complex organizational dynamics. I see this firsthand. When you think about the friction between security and developers, right? Developers, obviously overwhelm them with expectations, but it's actually, there's a lot more nuance to that, right? So the rise of DevOps actually created additional dynamics. So there's already dynamics between DevOps and DevOps and developers. When DevOps wants to standardize, enterprise DevOps pipeline, right? Want to standardize patterns, there's already friction with developers because if you think about the support language frameworks, I mean, there's so much, right? It's not overnight effort. So there's a lot of friction there. And literally I've worked with organizations who have, OpenShift, right? On-prem, they have everything scripted out, everything's containerized.
but it still takes weeks, months, sometimes to provision infrastructure. It's a process issue, right? And then you have security and DevOps, right? Because everybody wants to do security. A lot of the DevOps teams now have some inherent security responsibilities or portion of that, because one of those debates was that DevSecOps is DevOps to the right. So there's those kind of things. And then sometimes there's budget coming out of DevOps team for security tools. And obviously you have GitHub, JFrog, every DevOps tool out there adding even observability spaces, right? Adding security capabilities. So it's naturally create that friction between the DevOps security, and then you add these three parties and the frictions among them, which is crazy, right? So that's the dynamics right there. And then all that to say is that there's never ending backlog. The number one survey response when I talk to thousands now of developers is vulnerability fatigue, right? All these tools, all these little layers, scan, all dumped down to security team, right? And then the worst case is when you have somebody, and this is not to just typically have more thinking, managing these vulnerabilities using a traditional vuln management kind of best practices or lack of best practice or worst practice. If you think about AppSec specifically, right, for modern stack, app and cloud, that's the recipe for frictions and distrust, right? When you create SLAs on open source vulnerabilities, there's no fixes or it's not really exploitable, right? That's bad things happen. So as a result, you got frustrated developers, all goes back to distrust, right? That's kind of where we are. And obviously AI is not perfect, right? And where you have regulated industries, right? You have basically this picture depicts the problem, right? You get all these noises, right? If you look at this AI generated image, you're like, okay, what is this? This logo gets misspelled, right? That's kind of how developer sees a finding to them, right? Is this real? This is a noise. It is exploitable, or this one have no context. So this is kind of where we at, right? 2025, still all these issues, but why, right? Let's examine why. And this is kind of took time to really think about what happened in the last 20 years in development, right? To understand the trend leading to today, let's go back in time and just think about some of the key events and milestones in the software development. How does that actually lead to today? So back there in the early 2000s, right, you got the Agile Manifesto, very grassroots efforts, right? People start thinking more towards Agile versus waterfall. A couple years later, you got this lean engineering concept applied to software development in the early 2000s, right? So just building up to that. And then around early 2000s, that's when AWS is formed. But it's not until 2006 that AWS launched EC2 and S3. And obviously, you can see, over the course of 5 years after that, you have Microsoft and Google, right? The cloud computing started to happen. And then the famous Phoenix project that have really started the DevOps movement. Although, 2009, with Flickr and other unicorns that started experimenting DevOps, right? But really, the mainstream happens DevOps. So think about the velocity now, right? Now we have cloud, dynamic infrastructure on demand, and then we have accelerated software development. And then you have obviously the great Phoenix project that tells you got to do that, right? So around 2015, that's when there's the formal DevSecOps manifesto happening that, okay, let's think about adding security to this whole DevOps thing. So very first early attempts, right, experimentation, I remember during those 3-4 years from 2015 to 2019, there was a lot of discussions, white papers, examples, labs out there showing you what are some of the open source tools out there, right? You name it, from scanners to whatever, and proof of concept, how to integrate into a pipeline, into Jenkins. Great stuff. And that's also when organizations start to retrofit their existing scanners into DevOps pipeline, right? Hey, let's forget about whether it works with developer or not. Let's just try to put it there. Let's automate the scanning, using some custom scripts. Let's automate the Jira ticket creation. Now, mind you, when you automate noise, you multiply noise, right? So that's where friction happens. So I think back then, people too focused on integrating security. The whole shift left movement done incorrectly was the result of there's so much focus on just integration on the workflow versus operationalizing the results and working through the processes. And there's a rush to break the build. We talked to every security leaders out there back in the days, in that 2015 to 2019 days. We want to break the build. We want to integrate security and DevOps. We want to shift left. Well, when you rush to it, it's kind of bad things happen. And that's also when I remember cloud, right? Very much back then, the cloud, pre-2020 was very much lift and shift, right? And still very much IaaS. I mean, I have people, instead of using Amazon ECS, EKS, they're literally running Docker on EC2, right? I mean, that's just the days where people are still experimenting. But 2020 is the year when there's a push for cloud native, right? A container orchestration happening. People really understanding the concept of, going from ClickOps to infrastructure as code, right? And automate, that's kind of the recipe for, to move forward with the next level of DevSecOps, of getting the, deployment, at speed, right? With all that. And
Jim, can I ask a quick question?
yeah,
So I don't think I've ever talked to an AppSec group that have used the word GitOps. I mean, Psycho, we mentioned GitOps in certain, like, what is GitOps to you? And is it like a super niche thing, or is it like a trend that's growing? What's GitOps to you?
I want to hear the crowd as well. I think GitOps is just, treating, infrastructure deployment as software development, right? So treating everything going through a Git, including infrastructure. That way you can actually codify your deployment, your configurations and embedding security. That's an opportunity for the fully automated, so deployment, right? So to me, when you think about CI/CD, right, the D is either delivery or deployment. I mean, GitOps just make that D more towards deployment, right?
Something that DevOps would do.
Yeah, and I think that's GitOps an opportunity. It's not end all be all, right? I mean, there's debates on that, but I think obviously you need Kubernetes for that, right? So I think it's just an opportunity to start introducing the hardened configurations, all that. There's a hand raise right there.
So like a good example, I think, of how we do GitOps at the place I'm at is we all of our infrastructure descriptions, WAF, all the things that we're deploying are typically deployed via Terraform. And so before we actually do the deployment of a piece of software, and for us, that might be the development teams that are our customers on an SRE, or if we're deploying to production. So like all of the configuration changes are checked in, they're in a branch. So before we decide to deploy those things, we have, standard software engineering code review. We say, should we use a load balancer here? Should we use, multiple DNS records? How should we do a thing? And so there's that level of review collaboration that happens as a part of the infrastructure deployment, in addition to, how you would typically see that in a software engineering, writing the actual code.
That's super helpful. Do you use the term GitOps?
Yeah.
I love that.
So there's even more things you do with like GitOps, like you were talking about diffing infrastructure, for example. But you can also do things like pre-hook commits, for example, or pre-commit hooks where that you can run things as you're committing them, and they run scan the local developer's machine or something like that. There's also advanced tools like Smudge and I don't know if you ever heard of smudging with GitOps, where you can say, for example, one of my things, I can check in code or even secrets, and I have a tool that will automatically vault encrypt my secrets if I want to check them in for local development tools. And what happens is whenever I'm developing locally, those secrets are decrypted but available to me. But whenever I do commit them in, it runs what's called smudging, and it will run whatever you want to have it run, essentially a CLI command, and it will do that whenever you commit the code. And so I have it hooked into secrets so that when I commit them, they're automatically encrypted. Whenever I work with them, they're just clean. and plain text, so,
That's wicked cool.
yeah.
Really good to see that in this, live audience, you got folks actually are doing the practicing that, right? I mean, it's very advanced. I still see even 2025, not many are doing that. So thank you. That just shows that the converged between infrastructure and application, right? You're using a software engineering practices to manage and deploy, right? That's where you can really think about the next level, adding security to on top of that. So really good to see that we have, now problem is that it's not mainstream yet, right? So that's why I think 2019, when the DoD, how I have my career at DoD, they released their DevSecOps reference design. Part of that design was actually the concept of GitOps is in there. As well as the secure by design first version, DoD have this hardened repository called Iron Bank, where you have a repo that has pre-hardened, pre-scanned container images, some libraries, right? That's this exception to that, which is 2020, Colin Mellon, right? Software Engineering Institute, SCI, based on the DoD version, created their own DevSecOps implementation guide, right? So that's kind of, GitOps is part in there. I mentioned that because a lot of people don't know about it. So that's actually to me, that's an opportunity, right? But it takes slow to adopt. So if you want to advance AppSec, soft security, you got to understand the journey of that and use that advancement as an opportunity. So it goes back to if you're in practitioner space, aligning with the organization, your head of software dev, head of, the C-level, where the opportunity is. If you're part of that, if you're part of that decision-making process, hey, this is the benefit of moving towards that, right? And when we talk about security, then you're really going to be in the forefront, right? So there's more likelihood of getting security planned early versus being an afterthought, right? So that's the takeaway. So that's when I just talked about that actually. But 2020 is also just too much shift left challenges, right? There's like a lot of discussion around shift left done incorrectly. That's just, I keep saying it's the same thing. I think, 2020 is when it just came out, but there's not a lot of folks that are actually there yet. So still, there was just retrofitting, scanning tools in the pipeline. And that's when, remember, that's when I was on the solution side. I pretty much worked with every tools out there at the time, right? Trying them out. If you look at the vendor community, right, just a general statement here, some of the legacy scanners now, and then they actually shifted focus into being more developer friendly, right? So if you think the trend about, they understand, hey, look, let me just do it correctly. And then there's obviously another set of vendors innovating on the quality of the results, right? Faster, accurate. And then there's also the other part of it that I talked about, called adding to the gasoline to the fuel here is all the DevOps platforms that actually added security capabilities, right? But as a DevOps person, they're like, okay, well, if I'm paying this enterprise licenses, you're adding me for this, well, I just add this. Oh, wait a minute, maybe I forgot to check with security team. Is that who actually, work well, or it's two lines of code to integrate, it's good. That's kind of part of the issue. Now, 2020 to 2023, this is where the AI, right? I'm gonna just speed up, and then there's 2022, 23, there's AI, but also this is actually the critical point where the rise of platform engineering, right? And then DevOps, developer experience. That's the shift in DevOps. We've got to take advantage of that. But also there's when the cloud's offering advanced services for AI and machine learning. What that means is many organizations who may not be a big software development shop now are a software development shop because they're hiring data engineers, they're hiring people who are not developers writing code to experiment with AI, experiment with machine learning, right? So that itself is something they got to think about. And finally, we know where we are today, right? The whole thing about this whole using AI is weaponizing AI. Literally last month, somebody came up with vibe coding, right? Basically, conversational with AI bot, very dangerously, it can spit out code. Talking to Sean and I happened to talk to a customer recently, talking about the vibe coding. The code came out from vibe coding actually looked like somebody came from a little high school kid. Very wouldn't be something that I would put in production, right? So that's where we are. So overlay that, right? So let's talk about security, right? So OWASP, top 10, first one came out in 2003, right? And there's SaaS and DAST, it lasted until about, 2015. So back then, just SaaS and DAST. Now, if you're a vulnerability manager, or maybe when you want to be attesting, hey, I've done the scanning. Well, back then, we need to do scanning, using Tenable or Rapid7 or Qualys, like favorite infrastructure scanning. Those things have patching, all that. But as far as like scanning a code, you just kind of, okay, I scan, the scan's done. That's done. Whether fixed or not, it's another thing. It's just put in the rug. So and that's when, that never happened, right? So they could do that because back then the release cycle was long and there's not much focus on it. But when it comes to the DevSecOps period, and that's when all of a sudden, let's integrate the scanning, right? So the more left you go, I always say, the expectation is that the result gotta be fast, right? It gotta be, somewhat accurate in the sense that, trustworthy, I should say. And otherwise, the dev not gonna like it. But that's when the friction happens, right? Break the bill. I talked about the break the bill, right? And about 2017, 2018, the rise of open source, right? Every year, all the SCA vendors create this state of open source reports, right? You see the rise of, some open source adoption, right? You got SCA, just more tools, right? More layers. And then talk about the explosion of cloud native. Now people talk about cloud native AppSec, adding the open source, adding the container, adding the infrastructure code, the entire IT turning to code, right? So obviously vendors start doing that, right? And then there's SolarWinds attack along the way at the end of 2020. Remember that? So in other words, more things, more layers to worry about, more scanners, more findings. So more tools, more backlog. And 2020 is a time, so now you can understand. This is where the inception of it. We got a lot more layers, a lot more findings. And you need different tools, right? At the time, so some vendors try to consolidate, but the tools that part of the platform, when there's friction, they realize, you know what? Maybe the platform not a good idea. So there's an exception of let me buy best of breed to make sure that the SCA tool I bought at the time is more developer friendly, or the SaaS that I bought is actually have more accuracy, or let me experiment with IaaS at the time. So all that is to say, I need as a leader, as a person who's need to be responsible for, in charge of getting all the results. I need something that actually can single pane of glass to get all these findings in the same place. That's when application security orchestration correlation, ASOC, came to place. A couple vendors are that, okay, let me just have a tool that ingests all the findings so I can manage in this, single pane of glass, right? That's kind of what happens because of the noise, because of all the different layers. But here's the problem. That didn't end, right? So back to 2023 again, you got Log4j, and then you got API layer attacks, right? You got code to cloud. So more things. So at the time, that's when, the whole idea of just having a thing that takes all the findings and maybe aggregate, maybe duplicate dashboarding, still doesn't fix anything. Does it really improve developer experience? No, it doesn't. Remember, 2023 is about developer experience. How do we reduce risk? You're not reducing risk, you're just managing risk. So this is where the ASPM things happen. There's even more tool, more noise, right? Gartner 2023 created first version of ASPM. I say that to say, if you read the first version of it, it's pretty confusing. Because that's when, ASPM at the time was talking towards supply chain. So there's vendors out there focused on supply chain, which is legitimate. And then you have to, obviously you have ASOC vendors who adding, just saying the ASPM because of that. And then you have vendors actually focus on now, what's the next step? The next step is actually, let me take the findings, let me try to do something, some modeling, right, to make sense of it. So to make it more prioritized based on risk, right, versus just severity from the vendor, whatever vendor says A and B. And more consolidation happening. 2024, I want to mention that. Everybody know about MVD backlog? 2024, early Q1, Q2. MVD had huge backlog of new vulnerabilities have not been vetted. So there's that, right? So you can't really trust MVD as a source of, right? And so adding that means that, when you think about the complexity, vendors have to innovate, right? If you're paying for a solution, better not be just MVD, because and is that reliable, right? So with that, there's a lot happening in the ASPM space because, you know, you got to worry about supply chain, got to worry about data aggregation, because now tool does everything. And you got to worry about something that prioritizes it. So last month or month before, this year, Gartner ASPM version 2 now recognizes the thing. So just give a little bit journey about things happening. But again, why this happened? This happened because the complexity of the modern software development, attack surface, distrust noise, all that leads to the need have something new that can address this problem, right? It's kind of a precursor to the need. So I will quickly go over this. And what 2025, reflecting back as somebody who's done this quite a bit, what's still not happening? These folks are they're still not working together, right? We talk about silos, overlapping roles, there's ownership conflicts, again, budgets, you know, who should own what between DevSec and Ops. And then still, you know, reflecting back, you got AppSec leaders who, you know, nothing wrong, you can come from anywhere, but you can be a former pen tester, you can be a vuln manager, can be, you know, ex-developer, DevOps person, doesn't matter. But, you know, how do you normalize the skills to have to more well-rounded? Sometimes we look at the job description, it's you gotta know everything, right? But what's most important? So that kind of, and also created more frictions. And in some organizations I have to consult with, you know, they just think the hiring one AppSec person gonna solve everything. It's also a little bit unrealistic. It's about partnerships, about winning. You know, there's also the role of DevSecOps. Sometimes the DevSecOps role is interesting because that's an individual contributor role. The goal of some DevSecOps roles in certain organizations is that it's almost like a bridge, like the liaison here of just working with security, working with dev, with DevOps. So very interesting dynamics. Still need to define, right? And then I still hear about break the build too quickly, right? The figuring out the processes just skipped. Let me integrate a tool and let me break the build. There's no in between here. Still happens, and more dangerously, one size fits all. They're using policies. Okay, who should define the SLAs? Well, maybe it depends on the dev team. Maybe it depends on what they're building, right? But still, there's so much frictions right there. I think we are getting better. It's all not all negative. The positive, the new workflows, all that. I think people are getting better at fixing net new issues. Like when you have security fully embedded, especially GitOps, all that, if you're actually doing that, you can pretty much catch good net new issues. So if you measure, there's less issues into production for net new. So the rate of production vulnerability increase is pretty low. So I used to call them VER, vulnerability escape rate, right? You measure a function between, you know, vulnerabilities to production versus net new over existing. So the smaller is the better, but we still have to do better with existing production backlogs because you just have too many, right? I remember even the successful ones who did the break the build. Okay, critical and highs, right? Remember that? But when critical and highs are overwhelming, then what, right? You gotta have something else to figure out which issues really matter. So this is where there's a lot of opportunities. And then we need to move beyond from just, if you think about a brand new leader, right? You want to go AppSec, you want to go build a program, you want to integrate, you know, your security into dev workflows, you probably go team by team. Imagine in a large organization, you have your organic dev team who's increasing. You might have offshore folks. You might have acquisitions, right? It's just, there's nothing that can get you from 0 to 100 anytime, like in a short time. And last but not least, everyone wants to expand, right? So there's a lot of consolidation, but how do you find the right balance? So the taxes, this just came out end of last. So the dev actually have, you know, average 20%, right? 19% a week working on security findings. They all feel like there's a lot more findings, right? The context switching is real. So it's something got to be done, right? This is why the inception of ASPM is supposed to do, right? So I want to talk about what core features, right? This is not to any vendor. So think about what this can do to modernize your application security programs. The first thing is visibility inventory. Imagine you have something that can tell you, accurately map out your application projects, repositories, ownerships, all the build workflows, all the commits and branches, all the stuff. Who has the best, who has the perfect CMDB? Anybody? No, right? So it's not perfect, right? But something that help give you that holistic visibility, help you make informed decisions around what the risks are, but also help you really measure where you should focus on, right? Versus rather than team by team, if you can just look at everything that you have and create your own little structure, you want to group this, high business impact application by its own unit. If you want to set policies on that group, if you want that group to only have certain capabilities, feel free. And you can see the shadow repositories, right? You never know that some developers might be building something new that has an API connection somewhere that you don't know about. How can you have accurate inventory of all that continuously? That's something that ASPM can do that can help. And then you need data injection, right? Like I said, you have so many tools. Sometimes the best way to make friends between security and DevOps is make sure to say, hey, it's okay to use whatever you want to use, JFrog X-Ray if you're a big JFrog shop. If you standardize on GitHub Enterprise for all the repositories, if you want to use GAS, GitHub Advanced Security, CoQL, Dependabot, feel free to do it, right? Maybe some, as the group here, if you're security folks, are like, okay, I've done benchmark. I think the results not very good. But you don't want to piss them off, right? So maybe some dev like to use, they already adopted it. Why change something that's working? So you want something that actually can take that and make it better. That's kind of the reason of the injection, right? But obviously, and I think last year, there's, I think it resurfaced of the quality aspect of the scanners, right? So that's why, some up to, okay, I need the best scanners, right? Because some believe that the best way to qualify, or enrich data is at the source coming in, quality data coming in, quality come out. So there's options of native, right? Some vendors focus on that. And then the data layer is like, okay, I have duplicate findings. When I talk about the complexity of a cloud native application security, right? 2020 terms. How many folks actually have experienced that if you look at your SCA tool, looking at the application library for vulnerabilities, when you look at a container image scanner, which that have all overlaps there, right? Container scanners sometimes have libraries. Which one should you trust, right? So you got all the things that are happening. You want to make sure you deduplicate that, right? That's something that ASPM can do. And then what happens once you do the ingestion, whether it's your internal enrichment from your scanners, third-party duplication, you want to do something with it. Let's normalize the, what the vendor tells you what the risk is. Let's not look at a SaaS finding or custom code finding its own, and a library its own, a container its own, right? Infrastructure its own, secrets its own. Let's look at them together. Let's look at exposure path, right? People heard about the Wiz acquisition, Google? I mean, Wiz was successful because what was Wiz successful at first? The Wiz graph, show you the exposure path. We need to do the same thing with AppSec software, right? It's not just a finding. Many times, I reduce X findings, great. But the big picture, how do you actually prioritize? You gotta look at the whole attack path. So exposure path, obviously gotta enrich with external threat intelligence, right? The tool, if you buy a tool, you gotta make sure that it has some kind of threat intel, internal research team, partnership with other external entities, something better than MED, because I already talked about MED here, but MED backlog issues, right? You can't trust MED. And then think about explodability, right? Especially in the open source container space, things that's not, you didn't build yourself. Which ones, what aspect of that really matters, right? What libraries, dependencies, or independent dependencies actually are exploitable, are being called at runtime, right? The whole reachability fiasco with all the vendors now. So, but the idea is that you got to do some kind of exposure analysis to rank them better, something better than criticals and highs. And then you're adding business context, how you want to calculate risk, right? And some of the customers were adding to identity, right? On top of secrets over there, pre-commit hooks. Some of the context could be, hey, if there's a active identity secrets, exposure in that application, gonna be high business impact, right? So because a lot of these vulnerabilities, especially custom code, it requires credential, right? So if you add credential to defining it becomes something better. So something more than just tens and thousands of criticals and highs, right? So when we normalize that, then really moving toward the risk-based approach, right? Now, imagine you have something that can measure adoption, measure SLA, measure all that, and then you can enforce policies based on what you find by risk, by team, by projects. And that's kind of what this is about, is give you that tool you can do to do this at scale. Last but not least, nothing happens if you don't fix things, right? So it's not just about finding things. So you want to have one of the tool give you actionable insights about, okay, what happened, right? When you have the whole exposure path and root cause analysis, then you figure out what happened, who introduced it, when, how, and then you can build workflows to actually how to fix it, right? So that's kind of the idea of that. And if in case you decide that, okay, I have 10,000 criticals, once you apply all that, maybe there's only 5 that you focus now, right? Then you can actually downgrade, ignore, do whatever at scale. So what that looks like at the end is talk about four shifts going forward, 2025, right? I just forgot 4 things. Things we need to do going forward for AppSec. One, we need to do better at building culture, share responsibilities, and cross-functional teams. You can't do that alone, right? I mean, recent conversation, who owns API security? Is it people at CDN, right? The ops people? Is that people were managing WAF? Is it dev, right? If you have who owns the scanners? Who owns but if you have something that's extension, security capability extension of DevOps, who owns that? How do you build up a good RACI? So this is going to be important. I've been talking about for a while, right? That's why there's a role of a product security, right? There's many different interpretations. I think that one of the things that, I find organizations who actually embrace product security role is that role typically goes broader than just AppSec, right? Sometimes product security also have CloudSec, just a little bit of more consolidated, right? Somebody who's working with developers more closely. But there could be a shared role that can be split between different people too. I've seen that. But the goal is to define a very well-defined operating model of who does what using, RACI or whatever they want to do, lay it out between usually the ops folks and security people, but also if we think about triaging remediation, who come up with severity? Maybe you give dev those, especially those very well-respected staff engineers, software engineers who actually are trained security champions, right? The scope of this talk is not deep diving security champions, but idea is that you have people in the dev advocates who are actually good at software development, maybe empower them to define some rules. All that needs to be clarified. Now, how does the tech help? How does people process? But at least, a core use case could be, or should be, that you want to have the output make sense to dev, right? You want to integrate into the tool they want to be using, the workflow. The dev don't want to log into another console, right? If you imagine you have 10 different scanners, dev not going to log into 10 scanners. Not going to happen. They live in the IDE and probably GitHub or some kind of SCM, right? Kind of mainly. So that, but also you want to make sure you tailor to the DevOps folks, right? Bringing people together. A lot of the enterprise DevOps team are still trying to find ways to consolidate or at least trying to standardize some kind of patterns, right? Have more team adopt this whole well-architected, GitOps maybe, right? But how do you do that? Help them, sometimes they have the same thing. They want visibility. Maybe they don't even know what kind of dev workflows out there. So this tech can actually, if you bring the DevOps people along, they can quickly identify what do they have. So they can actually, okay, let me target this group because what I'm building, this framework, this language support, this workflow works for this language they're building on. So I know how I can prioritize. So it's the visibility. So how do you make friends? That's how you make friends. And let's not forget about security metrics reporting for security people. This is controversial. Sometimes the enterprise vulnerability management team, they don't understand AppSec, right? They look at everything. They look at networking vulnerability, looking at endpoint, looking at app to them, it's just a finding. So how do you make sure that you arm them with what they need to know to report up to their leadership without bothering you or harassing developers. So you need outputs for them. So that's why, this technology brings those people along as well, right? You gotta at least have a tool that make everybody happy. We need something beyond just code vulnerability. How about the supply chain, right? How about AI, right? So we know that now, rather than have 10 different tools, at least you need to have something that not only consolidate them, but also make sense of that, right? So I talked about all that. So obviously, the ASPM tool typically, most of them actually help you inventory, all your SDLC projects, figure out who owns what, map them, and also protect your supply chain. And obviously, I hope we don't force standardization. I feel the pendulum swing, right? Consolidation, standardization, then best of breed, or let me do what I need to do. Let me do what I want to do. So it's really about, let's just not force it. Do it where it makes sense. Let's embrace diversity, right? Sometimes I actually talk to the DevOps team. Hey, the standard enterprise pipeline makes sense. You get more as much adoption, but don't force people, right? Maybe over time expand, maybe have multiple patterns. But the idea is that we have to embrace, right? So from a security AppSec software security perspective, you have to embrace the different architecture patterns. So when you design your own patterns, or that show example, you want to be agnostic to the type of workflow, but still be able to, get what you need out of that, right? So some of the workflow I've seen in the past that was not working well is that they're very restricted to one, so you can't repeat at scale based on variety, right? Something should work for everybody. So ASPM give you that idea, right? You can obviously choose to ingest, right? But also you can integrate with different type of integrations, both dev and security. So you can have a holistic governance, right? You want to managing secrets, you want to managing infrastructure as code security, you want to managing your open source, you want to manage your custom code, you want to manage your runtime API findings. Do it all in one, right? So that's an idea. Last one. We need to modernize VM, right? The risk-based, right? Moving to risk-based, think about exposure analysis, prioritization, not just based on vendor severity. There's a lot of discussion around CVSS, right? There's a move from 3.1 to 4. Was not too much of improvement, maybe a little bit. There's actually exploitability predictive security scores, EPSS, another prioritization, metric for open source vulnerabilities. I talk about CISA KEV, right? KEV, obviously the TJ actions made it to the KEV. KEV not perfect either. Nothing's perfect. The idea is that you want to layer all these factors into something more holistic, right? And ASPM allows you to do that because it's supposed to take all that and let you customize as well as what's important to you as a business, create that type of prioritization. So you give actionable results to the developers so you can fix it. And then along the way, you want to measure progress, measure adoption. So you have a lot more granular metrics you can measure, and then you can report, right? In whatever format you want. So that's kind of overall idea. Now, to finish this, kind of overwhelm you with something more modern. So this is very advanced, only a couple of folks. So how do you combine, I'm not going to talk through this very detailed, right? So it's example workflow for very advanced organizations that I work with, very agnostic. The idea is how do you embrace the idea of shared responsibility among key stakeholders like security architecture, application product security, VM, and then the platform engineering enterprise DevOps, right? The idea of platform engineering based on the internal dev portal, the IDP. But this is where the dev portal could create all these pre-hardened artifacts, right? Embracing secure by design. You can have all the pre-hardened templates, right? If you're doing GitOps, hey, draw from hardened templates, Terraform, form templates, hardened container images. If you're adopting policies code, you got these code templates, YAML file definitions, right? All that in place. So dev can grab things that's already hardened and deploy any way they want. And I talked about the, you got your workflow got to be agnostic. So some actually build an orchestration layer, a web service typically, that abstracts the scanners from developers, right? Something is orchestrated that, when you onboard application, this orchestrator onboards it, calls the scanners, does the scanning, and push results to a place, usually ASPM. And then you got ASPM, process it, right, do all that, and then work with the enterprise VM team, but also work with the developer to fix it. So that way, it's just very complex, but it's an idea. All these abstractions make the whole experience better for developers and for security folks to reduce risk in a way and not be very restrictive, very open. So it's just an idea, right, an example. And with that, and my presentation. What question situation?
Yeah, let's have a round of questions. If you're on Zoom, you can put it in the chat or unmute yourself. But yeah, anyone have any thoughts, questions?
Hey, Jimmy, thanks for that. It was great. It feels like the role of the ASPM is maturing from the standpoint of it used to be a lot more just aggregation,
Yeah.
a little bit of correlation and reporting. And it feels like now it's the job to really help with the accuracy challenge that's in the market. So my question to you is, do you see ASPMs getting more involved with the scanning process itself, or still being the receiver of results from multiple?
Great question. I think now I see my vendor agnostic approach, right? I'll say this, the trends, right? So I think I like to draw, parallel to the SIM space. If you think about the SIM space, there's the log management, there's the analytics, right? Usually, hey, what's a SIM? The old SIM is just log management, right? So and then somehow you run Splunk query, you can, find needle in a haystack because you query. No, how do you do analytics, right? So I think there are two school of thoughts right now, right? I'm not here to say which one's better. Every scanner out there, if I can name it, right? Verico, Checkmarks, Black Duck, now formerly Synopsys, all that, Sneak, they have bought an ASPM or created one, right? You see that. And then you have those aggregators remain focused on just data, right? They think, I think those are good in a way that they can do correlation based on normal abilities using threat intel, all that, right? Scan agnostic, those probably are more of into the concept of universal unified vuln management. So those actually get into the infrastructure side a little bit more on the half and half. And then you have ASPM with scanners, right? And there's two school of thoughts. Either you want to have as many integrations, single pane of glass as much as possible, or you want to make sure, I don't want to, keep infrastructure separate, but work together, just like my last example. But you want ASP focused application layers. And then you want to control quality. So there will be, there's tools like Cycle that we focus on quality. So we build proprietary scanners, give a custom option, but also control the inputs, right? That we believe quality in, quality out. So as a trust but verify. So there's different two school of thoughts, right? I think that quality of input is very important when you're talking about custom code. How are you going to enrich a custom code vulnerability, right? Open source, maybe. If you look at, again, EPS is Kev, all that, to a certain extent. But again, you want to control inputs, right? To me, at some point, but you can't do everything, right? I think as a prediction in the next 2 years, that you see more convergence. Is to play out a bit more. But right now, it's just two school of thoughts.
So your idea would be in the most sophisticated version of it would be, you would have a service worker that could be called when you need to, and then it would almost dependency inject or use a strategy pattern to call specific tools in place of others, when it needs to, for example.
Yeah, so that actually comes out, that's pre-ASPM. So I built this for, when I was running consulting engineering, built some classmates. I know a lot of folks in large organizations, built that. When they say, build ASPM, what they mean is some kind of a service that aggregates, right? So the idea is you don't want developers to mess with the tools, and tool can change. Those are typically, so that abstraction is just meant to insulate dev with security tools. that part doesn't solve what you do with the data problem. That part just focuses more on the onboarding piece. But now I can tell you my experience building that as a side benefit is it makes the vendor very nervous. I have a customer who, had a customer who obviously didn't like the scanner that they had, but it was so entrenched, right? But with this, the after fact is you did replace them like that. So I think it's a good forcing function to make sure that whatever scanners are going to keep innovating. So, but also it gives, but it doesn't, it does not piss off developers. Yeah, I have another customer who, twice, there's two strike, right? The first one, was bad, very difficult to integrate. But when we yank it out, it just impact a lot of the stuff. Well, with that abstraction, then it just that complexity is gone.
You abstract like the log ingestion, for example, if you use different SIMs, abstract like the output so that it could take whichever tool you put in place.
Yeah, you want developer just focus on IDE or pre-commit hooks or pull requests, right? Like that's it, and interface with that. Everything else, no, they want to get in, look at the stuff, sure, right? Detail, but everything should be back to them. Everything else should be magic, right?
Yeah.
From a developer experience perspective.
You gonna provide some context to that? Yeah. So we were talking about this a lot. And I've been working for AppSec vendors for 10 years, not a practitioner like Jimmy, but I have friends at every single AppSec company. And one of the things I saw, and I have a lot of appreciation, is for true visionaries and experts. And there was a company called Zero North back in the day that kind of pioneered this ASOC space. That was the first thing that Jimmy pointed out. And a word that I loved was somebody said one day, if you want me to be the O in ASOC, orchestration and correlation, I need to take custody of the scanner, right? And Zero North had brilliant people and they tried to take custody of scanners and say, with this code change, I want to blast it with some SAST. But then the next code change, because of the risk, I'm not going to blast it. And that never worked. That concept of trying to take custody of the scanner never really worked. And Zero North never really became anything. Then ASPM became, okay, if we can't take custody of a third-party scanner, let's try to ingest, dedupe, prioritize, most importantly, remediate. When you get into the remediation space, you have to trust on and rely on that scanner's ability to deliver you information quick enough so that you can act on its behalf. And I think this is a natural progression to Jimmy's great example of SIM log. You're just sucking in the information and looking at it. Great example of that too is Datadog. I'm fortunate to work with an early employee of Datadog really early in my career. What a wonderful run Datadog's gone on. They make $2+ billion a year. They just said, we are just going to ingest everything and be a dashboard, right? So now you have that paradigm. And I want to institute another important aspect that we've seen at ASPM is business, right? Think about the business problem of ASPM. FanDuel has this beautiful office and it can afford to have this wonderful meeting because it makes a lot of money, right? So I want you to think about AppSec vendors for a second. Those that AppSec companies that actually buy an ingest dashboard are your JPMCs, your biggest AppSec programs. And there's like 40 of those to sell. And so if you're an ASPM provider and you start a company and you're trying to sell to these big AppSec programs, there's very few of them to sell to, and they only represent about $40 million in annual revenue. These companies are funded by venture capitalists who need a giant annual revenue. They need to say, oh, we can sell to everybody. We're going to make $100 million, $1 billion in revenue. So those companies are saying, I don't know if I can actually remediate these third parties, and my market I'm going after is pretty small. So the biggest market in the world that's AppSec is still very small, right, is scanners. It's about $2 billion worth of spend for scanners. So you're finding out both from a technical standpoint, we really can't do much with third-party scanners. And from a business sense, I really can't make that much money to justify all the money I've raised as a company. And so now I'm getting into scanning. And so that's why from a business sense, and I'm trying to be as vendor agnostic as possible, that's what you've seen through all the vendors, so.
Yeah, and there's two trends, right? There's two trends, to answer your question. I see, again, it doesn't matter which side, right? Because I told you the acquisition's happening, the scanners, the aggregators, so I think I think there's a convergence happening, two convergence. Convergence of scanner and ASPM into one. There's also the convergence of the no scanner or scannerless ASPM into UVM space. So the one without scanners is gonna actually have more data from the infrastructure side, right? May or may not have the context, but nevertheless, the value of that is single pane of glass, right? And you can bring together VM team and AppSec team, at least from a management perspective. UVM, the M is management, whereas the more of a developer-focused use case will be the ASPM. That's my opinion. And then Sean talked about remediation, right? Goes back remediation. Remember I said, you got to inventory the ownership of repository projects, makes sense, all that. How are you gonna remediate something if you don't know where it come from? Right? Imagine a DAS finding, it tell you a black box, a CDBE injection from a endpoint. How do I know where that come from, right? And the ASP can help you track all the way to where it comes from, right? Through obviously runtime context down to where it come from, and all the way maybe to the repository. And if the repository have an owner, then you can see, okay, actually this repository has, trace all the way to that may have the source code. And then you look at source, SAS scan maybe and figure out lines of code and figure out who owns it, right? You can build automation, but without that context of who owns it and the root cause analysis, you can't really do anything for remediation. That's but that stuff's very hard to do when you just do, let me just work on 100 integrations, right? So at some point, I think as a vendor, you got to decide what you want to focus on, right? And, the CNAP space, right? Also trying to get, code to cloud, right? So there's that's my point. I mean, vendor gonna do, what they're gonna do to expand, right? Because I feel like it's a pendulum. A few years ago, there's like best of breed happening, right? Certain vendors like scanner innovating, right? But then the budget, the economy, right, like consolidate. I think Sean, you and I talked to some customers like that. Because, good enough, right? Good enough is good enough. And then, I think the pendulum swung again. Maybe it's the economy, maybe it's because the trend I talked about that. If you really want to solve a problem, you have to have a balance. Some things you cannot just take a risk of good enough, because that good enough, maybe it can save a couple of dollars, but it will piss off developers even more, right? So that's the balance. What gives you that option to have that balance is something like ASPM.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.